All right, should be recording now. So today we have Dry Apologist joining us. So why don't you start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and your content? I know we've talked before, but just some people on my channel might not know who you are. So a little introduction.
All right, yeah. So I have a channel called Dry Apologist. I post arguments and I have some discussions and debates on there. And yeah, I just enjoy the discussion. So yeah, check out my channel if you're interested.
Yeah, I feel like your video quality has been going up. Like you've been having like
Oh,
you did all those Pine Creek videos. I thought those were funny. But then like just some of the ones where before it would just be you, kind of like right, on your webcam, whatever, just talking. But now it's like it's got like slide, the quality is increasing. I like it.
yeah. I'm learning a few tricks, so
Yeah,
a little better over time.
yeah. What kind of do you have like a mic that you use when you record, or do you just kind of like use the headphone mic?
Yeah, I do use a microphone because the headphones will have static.
Yeah. Yeah, I couldn't remember. I know the visuals definitely were like getting a lot better, but I'm trying to remember the sound. But yeah, I mean, yeah, it's definitely gotten a lot better. So primarily during this, I wanted to talk about, you have a unique like approach to theodicy, or just explaining the problem of evil, or the variations. Goodness gracious, I can't speak. The variations of the problem of evil. So you want to briefly outline your theodicy? And first of all, is it a theodicy? Are you sure? You can explain what it is and then why it's a theodicy. So.
Sure. Yeah, so a lot of time in the literature on the problem of evil, there's a distinction between a defense and a theodicy. So a defense is something that's logically consistent, but somebody may not find it plausible, but it would say like, if all these things are true, then there's no logical contradiction between God existing and allowing suffering. But a theodicy is making a stronger claim that like these things seem plausible, if God exists at least. So it seems like this would be like what we would intuitively expect, or at least would be plausible given like a Christian outlook or whatever somebody's theological outlook is. For me, it's Christian. So yeah, so I think that my argument does qualify as a theodicy. I don't think there are any points that seem implausible to me, at least. Of course, that's going to be somewhat relative to the person and their intuitions, but I do think it qualifies as a theodicy. So yeah, do you want me to go into it now, or is there something else I should qualify about?
No, I don't think so. I was going to say, yeah, because that's one of the things. Because a lot of this, it kind of rests on a certain sort of intuition about God's moral obligations. And I think, one of the approaches I would, if I were to, again, this isn't going to be me. I have a couple arguments, like I said before we started recording. This, I'm still feeling it out, and I want to make sure that I have a full understanding. Like, if I were to actually like really engage, I'd probably write like a blog post, kind of detailing where I reject. But so, kind of just be talking it out a little bit. But yeah, one of my main thoughts as I read your paper, I read the updated version too. I don't remember what the changes were, but is it because it's resting on a sort of intuition about God's moral obligations, then to a degree that anyone has other intuitions that they find plausible that conflict with your one intuition. Like maybe there's a handful of intuitions that someone finds plausible, that if any of those or all of them are true, then your theodicy is false. And so like one way to kind of go about it would just be, okay, well, you have this kind of plausible intuition, but I have all these seemingly plausible intuitions over here. And so that's not, so that's kind of would be, if I were to go in depth, that would be my main approach. Like here are all these other plausible intuitions that kind of conflict with it, but we'll get into that, I guess, maybe a little bit. But yeah, so why don't you go ahead and explain the theodicy?
Yeah. Yeah, and I recommend that if somebody's not familiar with it, to watch my video on my channel called The Perfect Well Theodicy, because it's pretty comprehensive. I don't go through every objection, but most of the main ones, and then I do respond to a number of objections in the comments as well. So I definitely recommend somebody watch that.
I'll make sure to link to stuff like that in the description.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. So yeah, the theodicy, and to also be clear, it is an original theodicy, but I am drawing upon, so I'm kind of weaving together some thoughts from some scholars. So it's not like no argument's going to be 100% original, but as far as I know, like this is an original argument. And then, so yeah, the argument goes like, I'm arguing that any universe that God creates, it's necessarily going to have, the laws of physics are necessarily going to be interconnected, and they're going to work as a system, as a whole, permeating throughout that universe. And in order to bring about certain ends, so certain processes within those laws, God's going to create the laws, or the system of laws conform to his intellect and his will, so basically the features of his mind. Now, since God is perfectly loving and just, if the system of laws was perfectly conformed to his mind, and he's wanting to bring about a universe with humans in it, then not only is there's going to not be suffering, but people are also going to be in a perfect relation with God and one another. They're going to have perfect love and desire to treat each other charitably, because at least plausibly that's something that an all-loving God would necessarily want. He's not going to want people to have, desires to hurt one another and so on. And that's pretty plausible, I think, and consistent with a Christian eschatological outlook. But the next step is, I argue that it would be wrong for God to force somebody into this perfect relation where they necessarily must love and devote themselves to God and each other. And the analogy I use, it'd be like placing somebody in what I call like a love machine. So or a device you could put on somebody and that control their brain where they have to love somebody. Now, it might be a good thing for them to love you. It is a good thing, but it still seems like that's an extreme amount of coercion to force upon somebody. So it would be unjust for God to force somebody into that world where they have to love God and love one another and be in this perfect relation. People should instead have a freedom if they want to journey to that world or not. So then God has to create, if he wants to create humans, he has to create them in a universe where the system of laws of physics is not perfectly, or not fully, I should say, conformed to his intellect and will. But then if the system of laws is not fully conformed to his intellect and will, then it's going to bring about processes that he doesn't fully desire, because there's this partial conformity, and then that's going to lead to the natural evils and I argue a less number of miracles and such, because again, it's not fully conformed to God's intention. So it's going to be not a horrible universe, but it's going to be overall a less good universe than the one that God ultimately wants to bring people to. And then once he creates all the humans that he's hoping to, I argue then at that point he'll conform that system of laws fully to his intellect and will, and then bring about the new heavens and new earth that Christians believe, that final eschaton, and then that'll be, the ideal world. But he has to start humans out in this pre-new heaven, new earth universe. And I think that this is pretty consonant with Romans chapter 8. So this is always the verse that I bring up. So chapter 8, 19 through 22, which somebody can look up, but it's about the groaning of creation. And I'm not saying that that's what Paul has in mind per se, but I think it's consonant with what's being described there, that God has subjugated the world in order to then bring about a greater world at another time. So I look at the theodicy as being pretty consonant with Christian theology, and I think that it can account for any particular example of suffering. So some theodicies will argue, well, God allowed this event of suffering because there's some greater good. He has some plan for it. And I find that pretty implausible for some events, and that has a number of difficulties. But this argument's saying, well, no, they're actually, a lot of events, maybe most, God doesn't really have a plan for it. He just allows it because, the system of laws of our universe is not fully conformed to his intellect and will. So there's going to be events and processes that come about that are less than ideal. And then I also apply it to animal suffering as well. And then I argue that, animals will be a part of the new heaven and earth as well. So, and I see that as being consonant with Romans chapter 8 too. So I don't have a problem saying that there'll be an animal afterlife. And there have been some notable theologians that have been open to that idea too. So some people are put off by that, but I don't see a problem with it. So anyways, when it all comes together, there are definitely some considerable objections, but I think that it's pretty plausible, and I think that it works as a theodicy. Now, one thing I want to make clear, though, is that a theodicy, of course, doesn't have to prove itself. It's just saying this is plausible hypothesis that, shows a compatibility. I'm not saying I can demonstrate all of this is true. I'm saying if somebody's a Christian and they accept this, then they shouldn't find suffering to be something they intellectually can't get around. In the same way, like, an atheist might speculate about theories of mind or like a multiverse or something to respond to a theistic argument, and I look at that as being legitimate as long as they're being consistent. So hopefully that makes
Yeah,
sense. But
I was going to bring up the animals, but you beat me to it. So in your conception, is there like a one-to-one correspondence in the new heavens and new earth between like animals that have lived, suffered, and died, and those that will kind of populate paradise? Would you say
like
that pretty much?
the same ones, you mean?
Yeah, like so. I don't know, the deer or the fawn dying in the fire. Like, is that specific fawn going to be resurrected, or is it going to be like just fawns? Period. Like, there's fawns
Right.
in the
I
heavens.
think Yeah, I think plausibly it would need to be the same one because there's that kind of compensation. Like, if it was a
Right.
different human in the afterlife, then that would be kind of difficult to see how I would be compensated. But I don't think the theodicy has to. So, like, if somebody found an implausibility with that, I don't technically think that it would have to because it has to do with, and we might get into this, but God's intentions. So, I could wait to see where you go with things, but I don't think it has to. But yeah, I'm inclined to think it'll be the same animals. Yeah.
Yeah. Does that like include like insects and stuff too? I mean, I haven't thought deeply into. As I've said before, if I thought theism was true, I would have to, you know, I would have to have like an animal afterlife picture and all that stuff. I think it would explain a lot more. But I haven't really like dug deep into like what that actually would look like. Because I mean, there's lots of insects. You know what I mean? Saying I think I remember on Felipe Leon's blog, he linked. I don't know if he linked to a paper, if he wrote it himself, but he was talking about there's the problem of insect suffering now. Like they're starting to learn that they could probably experience more pain than we thought. And if that's true, and we start to learn more about that as we learn more about biology, then that would make the problem of apparently gratuitous suffering even worse. If we find out that that it's like insect suffering is worse than we had imagined. So we'll see where that goes. I don't know this. I can't really argue for that point, but I'm just saying, to put that on the radar of some people, it may be the case that sentient, there might be more sentience there than we had imagined, but I don't know if sentience is.
Dustin Crummett, I think maybe that was the paper. I haven't read it, but I think he has a paper analyzing the problem of insect suffering. And I'm inclined to think insects would as well, especially if they have suffering. And again, like that might strike some people as shocking, but David Bentley Hart has a good some essays on the animal eschaton, and so that would be somebody I would recommend. And yeah, I'm inclined, especially if an animal suffers, that they'll be part of the afterlife. Because under my theodicy, the argument is that our universe is a partial reflection of the heavenly universe, so of the new heavens and new earth. So if we're finding something in this universe, it's because God wants it in the next one too. So sometimes Christians have this like Platonic type view of the afterlife where it's like we're just a soul that's like just up there, but that's really not the traditional Judeo-Christian vision of the resurrection. It's that God's going to recreate a physical universe that's just going to be better than the one we have. So yeah, I don't really see a problem with saying there's going to be animals and insects and such, and we may need more space to fit every creature, but I don't see a problem with that either. So, but yeah.
Right. And just to clarify, there might be some people that are new to my channel or whatever that are watching and might not know like why, there's some skeptics that are really dogmatic about like, all believers are stupid and all that stuff. The reason I spend my time, talking to people like you and others that I've had on this channel is because, well, for one, even if I'm skeptical of your theodicy, it's way more empathetic of a theodicy than some other theodicies, at least in my view. And a lot of the Christians I want to talk to are the ones that, we can come to an agreement that, hey, these things are actually a problem. Like, it's not like some of the fundamentalists are going to be like, they basically kind of brush it under the rug and act like there's nothing wrong here. There's a lot of common ground where we look out at the world and they're like, and then we just have different ways of explaining why it's like that, why the cringe, when we look out. Yeah. But at least we're coming to a common understanding that, there actually is a problem here. And also too, if there happens to be any Christians that watch any of my stuff, you don't have to be a fundamentalist. Go to Caleb's channel, go to other people's channels. Like there's other options for you. If you are deconstructing and you don't necessarily, you can join Team Atheist if you want to, but you don't have to maintain fundamentalism. Anyway, I just wanted to go on that little side tangent. Yeah. So animals. So I guess we're talking about greater good. So I guess, wouldn't it technically? So you're saying that every specific instance of suffering is not necessarily tied to a greater good, but wouldn't it be the case that for God to choose to create at all, isn't he doing so for the greater good of like creatures having a relationship with him or having the opportunity? So isn't it sort of still for the greater good? It's just not, you're just not connecting specific instances of suffering to the greater good, but you'd still kind of fall into, not a trap, but you still fall in sort of to the idea that creation would have still had to have been for the greater good in some sense, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it depends upon what one means by a greater good. So I would say like any moral action is gonna, have some greater good in the sense that there's something good that's being achieved, and God creating, He's going to be working to bring about a greater good for the beings that He creates. But a lot of times, specifically when somebody says like a greater good theodicy, what comes to mind is like you said, like greater particular goods. Like this specific event was brought about because it was to like God allowed this tragedy to happen so this other person would convert to Christianity or grow in courage or something. Like every suffering is directly connected and tied to bringing about some greater good, and that's what I'm contesting. Like I don't think that that's very plausible, and yeah, the theodicy isn't committed to that.
Right. Is so on the whole, is it a sort of, is it better for God to have created the possibility for creatures to go into relationship with him versus him not doing that, like on your view? Or is it kind of equal? Like so for example, you imagine like the alone world, I guess, is what you would call it, like God, in perfect bliss, not creating, versus he creating in the perfect, imagine the perfect will theodicy is true, and he creates, and you compare these two like possible scenarios. Is one better than the other? Are they equal, or does it matter? Like on your view,
Yeah.
like the totality of all the state of affairs.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that kind of borders on another argument that I address on my channel. I call it the argument from creation. So, like, would God create? And sometimes that gets equated with a version of the problem of evil, but I look at it as a distinct argument. And in my view, I would say it's equal in that it's equally good, ontically speaking, if God exists on his own or if he chooses to create, but certainly it's better for us if he chooses to create, I would argue, so that we can partake of good things as well. I mean, I want to exist, and I want to exist, in eternal happiness, so it's better for me, but in terms of like, an ontic state of affairs, God on his own, I think achieves everything on its own. But I do think he is justified in creating for others, so hopefully that makes sense. But yeah, I think God is free to create or not to create, though.
Okay. There was one instance, you just did it again, but there was an instance where you kind of like glitched. So if you lose connection, just refresh. It wasn't like a big one, but you probably already know this because you use StreamYard. But if you like lose connection, just refresh the page and it'll bring you right back. Didn't you? So you sent me a paper. I read the paper version. Did you try to submit that anywhere or anything, or like what was the story with that?
I'm trying to get it published, but it's not always easy. So maybe one day.
Yeah, I don't know any of the process. Because I don't know.
It's
You have to be like
challenging. Yeah.
I mean, do you have to have like a certain degree? Like, I have no clue how publishing a paper works. So
I don't know much either. But no, you don't have to technically have a degree, but it probably helps if you have a PhD and you're a professor and such. But no, it's possible, but I haven't gotten it published yet.
Right.
I'm working on it, but who knows?
Yeah, I forgot to say, in honor of Valentine's Day, an atheist and a Christian are going to destroy each other with facts and logic. So, this will be a special treat for the listeners. So one of my other questions, those questions I asked were actually kind of off the cuff. The first question that I actually had written down was, so why would the physical laws be in accordance with God's intellect and will? Why would that force a relation? Can you elaborate on why? What about the laws being perfectly in accordance with God's intellect and will would actually force a relation? Can you just elaborate on that? Not necessarily an objection, but I just want some clarification for how that works.
Yeah. So the idea is that there's a causal connection between God's intentions and what the causal laws will manifest. So if God intends for there to be fire, then there's going to be fire, and in order to create with consistency, the material world's going to have physical laws. So if God intends for those physical laws to bring about event X, then him being omnipotent, it's going to bring about event X, and that God would desire, at least plausibly, an all-loving God would desire for people to have perfect love, like he does. So there wouldn't be the possibility to deviate and choose not to love somebody, or to harbor some even little bit of jealousy or resentment, because that would be a diminished will. And that, I mean, that's a traditional understanding, at least within a Christian outlook. So, that would correspond with God's will. And assuming the laws of physics are kind of what causally undergirds everything in the universe, you know, if God desires for people to be fully loving, then that's what's going to automatically come about. At least that's the argument. And but if he forces somebody, so he creates somebody directly in that universe where all they can do is but love God, that is a good thing. But it does seem like, at least plausibly, that is kind of a forced relation. They didn't really get to choose to enter that into that relation or not. So I would use that analogy. It's kind of like putting somebody in the love machine, and it's like, well, you're gonna love me because I'm putting you in this machine, and it's gonna happen. And that, to me, that seems like that's at least plausibly a forced relationship. So that's where God would need to create him out, in a universe where these causal regularities are only partially conform to God's intention. So some things God wants are brought about. In general, there's going to be humans and animals and such, but not the exact causal regularities. And then that's where you get these other undesirable traits.
So I guess I'm just confused where this intersects with, like, so you believe in libertarian free will. So why, I guess maybe a better way, maybe we're not understanding how you're defining some terms. So the physical laws, why couldn't they be, in an optimal state, and you still sort of have libertarian free will? Because or agent causation, so I guess, well, I don't know if this will go into some of my arguments at the end, because I don't want to spoil it, but it seems to me that, it seems plausible to me that, you could have physical laws that are perfectly in accordance with God's intellect and will, and still have, if libertarian free will is even coherent, you could still have libertarian free will in that sense. And if you can have libertarian free will in that state of affairs, then it seems to me that you're not actually being forced into a relation. So it's almost like what you're saying is that if this state of affairs were to transpire, you no longer have libertarian free will. But I think that's I think there's people that believe in libertarian free will that would be like, I don't know about that, just based on what it means to have libertarian free will. So I don't want to go too far into that. I'm just kind of putting it on your radar. Unless you want to, I'll give you a chance to respond before we continue. But
I'll respond to it real quick. So that's a good point. So I make a distinction between moral freedom and, you could say, non-moral freedom. So I think in, the new heavens, new earth, or we could just say heaven for short, we'll still have non-moral freedom. So I could choose if I want to eat vanilla ice cream, I want to eat chocolate ice cream, assuming there's nothing morally attached to that. I can still make that type of choice, but I won't be able to make the choice whether or not I'm going to, slander somebody or whatever, because that's a moral agency. And so I still think that we'll have libertarian free will, but because we'll have perfect love, we're not going to be able to even muster that desire to, like, well, when I go slander that person, I resent them, and so on. So it's not so much that we're determined in the sense that we're controlled or we lack free will. It's just that our desires will be so heightened that we'll never choose wicked things. And that's what the laws of physics, I'm arguing, will bring about, is these perfect desires. So, so hopefully that at least makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll get into it a little more later. But so what can you? Definitions are important, especially when we're talking about stuff like this. So what is a forced relation? So can you define what you mean by when you use the phrase like a forced relation or a forced relationship, and then explain? You kind of already alluded to by using the love machine analogy, but define the way you're using the term forced relation, and then also explain why plausibly it's unjust on your view. So just define it and then explain what's wrong with it.
I would say a forced relation. So in the paper I target, it's a forced perfect relation. So you could argue that maybe that any relation, I wouldn't use the word forced, but if somebody wants to say there's some influence exerted in any relation, then that's fine. But however you want to put it. But the idea that it's being forced is that you couldn't have but been in that relation. So
could it not have been? Is that
right. So it's necessitated. And if God creates somebody in that universe where their love is perfect, then they can't but love God. So
Mhm.
I'm arguing then that's what makes it forced. And of course, it's going to come down to a moral intuition, but to me, there seems to be something unjust about that. Like using the love machine analogy. And that can be a point where somebody could say they have a different moral intuition, but I do have a pretty clear moral intuition that that's at least plausibly unjust. I do think that there seems to be something problematic about it.
Okay. All right. So I guess that kind of ties into what I was going to say next. So um, let me see. How should I ask it? So does lacking the ability to consent to? So let me phrase this correctly. Does lacking the ability to consent to a relation always make that relation immoral?
It depends. So
This is
if
what I'm trying to
somebody,
draw out a little
yeah,
bit.
yeah. So like caring for somebody and they can't consent to it might be something that we have to do to care for somebody. So, you get in a bad accident and you can no longer care for yourself, or say you just never develop the cognitive abilities. We should still have the charity to care for that person, and they can't technically consent to it, but I would say we have an obligation to still care for them. But if we could give them the freedom to consent, I think that that would be preferable. And especially if we're talking about like an intimate relationship, I think somebody has the right to have autonomy over that. You shouldn't be forced to marry somebody who you're not interested in. So the more intimate the relationship gets, I would say probably the more autonomy you should have, and and it's always preferable that somebody does have freedom over it. So God, we're talking about his perfect intentions. I think it's plausible that he would prefer that people, not just prefer, but his being a perfectly moral agent, he would be internally obligated to grant people the opportunity, at least, for freedom to enter into the most intimate type of relation with him and with other people.
Hmm. So this kind of relates to one of the objections. I don't remember what you called it specifically, but it was basically the idea of, you know, how is it really different if God just like forces you to exist? So there's the idea that I might have been Counter Apologist who was talking about this. I think I watched your exchange as well, but the idea is like if God creating you in this kind of perfect bliss environment, and then you choose God, in that environment, if there's something kind of wrong with that, then if forcing that relation is excessive in some way, then why wouldn't it be also excessive to like force people to exist against their will? Especially if God knows that those people are going to end up in, well, I think you're an annihilationist, but still, that they're not going to make it, as it were. So, like, I guess my question then would be, I guess I struggle with the intuition that, like, on the one hand, there's something excessive about basically being created in heaven, is a word, I guess, and something not excessive about forcing someone to just exist in the first place, and then kind of go through the veil of tears, and then not even end up in heaven in the end. So, like, to me, I don't. I know technically speaking, you could, the way you define your words and stuff could get around it, but it just seems someone could share the intuition that there's not really that much, though technically the way you word it, there's a difference kind of in general. It's hard to see like a big difference. But go ahead and elaborate about that. I won't.
Yeah. So I'll say, so you brought up the afterlife. So I'm agnostic on the state of the afterlife in terms of annihilation and such, but I'm a hopeful universalist. So I do hope
Oh, good.
humanity's saved, but I don't commit myself to universalism or even to annihilationism, even though I've defended it some, but I don't hold the eternal conscious torment. But
I'm a hopeful universalist too, just an atheist.
Right, but I ultimately, I think God's going to do the just thing. We just don't know all the details, is my view. But yeah, so I think, and you also brought up saying like God knows that they're not going to make it. I don't know if that's the case either. That's going to get into one's view of God's foreknowledge, which there are different perspectives on how that works. So, but just getting into that core objection though about is forcing somebody to exist really different than forcing them into heaven or whatever. To me, it seems like there is a difference. One, because even if it's, you're forcing somebody to exist, that's essential to granting somebody their autonomy. I mean, somebody can't make choices or experience good things at all unless they exist. And, causally they would have to be, forced into existence in order to then do that. But it doesn't thereby mean that any amount of force is thereby justified. So to me, it's like a minimal level of force. But saying that God has to force somebody to exist wouldn't thereby say, well, then it's okay for God to then force them into a relation. I would say, that's going an extra step. So that's how I'd respond to that.
I just thought of something that I hadn't thought of. So God, I mean, assuming the traditional theism where God has foreknowledge, or God knows, he's all knowing. Okay. So if wouldn't it then be a forced relation if God creates a person knowing that they would not want to exist once they do exist? So imagine God. So, there's lots of people now who wish they were never born. I'm sure that's, there's even, there's sentiments in the Psalms like that as well. And there's all across human history, and there are people that kill themselves. So, there's plausibly God would have knowledge of someone who would not want to exist. And then basically, to me, that seems like a forced relation in some way, because you're violating their consent. So, I mean, it's not a forced relation in the exact same way that they're not forcing a relation to perfect union with God. But it seems like if there's something morally objectionable to this kind of picture of forcing people against their consent in various ways, then it seems like if God knowingly creates on this kind of moral system, it seems like if God were to create someone knowing who he knows would not want to exist, not consent to existing, basically, then he's in a sense, violating their autonomy, as it were, because he has that knowledge before. Does that make sense? I'm just thinking this now. I haven't thought it through. I'm just thinking it. So,
yeah, that makes sense. So, I do kind of question the idea that there are people who truly don't want to exist, but I'm not saying that's implausible. But to me, it makes sense that somebody might want to exist, but on their own terms. So they want to exist, but not with God. They want to exist and be evil. I don't know if there's anybody that actually wants to not exist, but I'm aware of that people do make that claim. So that would be a fair objection under like a Molinist perspective of God's foreknowledge, where God knows what those people would want before creating them. I am fairly skeptical that God's foreknowledge works like that. I understand there are a lot of Christians who do hold that view. And it might be a fair objection if somebody holds that view of God's foreknowledge. I look at it more like God knows all the events that are happening because he's outside of time, but I don't know that he has this counterfactual prior creation knowledge. So it might be a fair objection if there are people like that and God has that type of knowledge, then you could say it would be unjust for God to cause them to be. But I know we're getting kind of into the weeds, but it also gets into a difficulty about how it is that people actually are brought about. So under this view, it could be, if people are brought about because of the causal influences of the material world, then it could be that God actually doesn't have total providential control even of the people that come into existence. That's not my view, but that could be another out somebody could take. So there are different theological positions, and I know that can get frustrating to some people, but there are a lot of different positions one could take to say, like, well, maybe that person has to bite the bullet, but this other theological view doesn't. And I try to be kind of just open on a lot of the views, but that's how I would respond, though. I don't know, hopefully that kind of made sense.
Yeah, I mean, and there's also ways where again, this is a fresh thought to me, but there's ways that I'm thinking of, like, if someone with a different position were to say this, then what would I say? I think there's ways to formulate what I just said in a better way that would encompass more theological positions. But again, I have to think about it. But so another thing that was interesting was, so the idea is that God has to create a world where the laws aren't perfectly in accordance with his intellect and will, in order to have basically like people choose God in a free sense that's not coerced. So, but couldn't, and then you make a claim that I thought was interesting, that you think it's, I don't know what wording you use, but basically the idea is, the objection is, well, if that's true, then why is there so much evil? Why is there so much suffering? Like, couldn't there be a state of affairs or some possible world that meets this criteria of not all the laws being in accordance with God's intellect and will, but it has less suffering, like a lot less suffering than the one that we're in now. And I think your response is essentially like, it was almost like kind of like either it's perfectly in accordance or partially in accordance in this exact way. Almost, it seemed like what you're saying. So basically, you're denying that there's like grades or like variations in the amount of suffering there could be under the system. So I don't really find that plausible at all. But I wanted you to defend that a little more, because you kind of in passing said a couple things. So go ahead and give your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's important to clarify that under this view, that with the system of laws being only partially conformed to God's intellect and will, that he's not going to thereby be totally determinate over the effects. So if somebody says, well, that's fine, like the laws can be only partially conformed to God's intentions, but then why doesn't he make sure there's not suffering? I mean, that's not what you're saying, but if somebody were to say that, I would say, well, I don't think you understand what I mean when I'm saying that they're only partially conformed to God's intellect and will. I'm saying he doesn't determine all the effects. But yeah, it's still a fair, well, why doesn't he conform the system even more? And so two things to that. I would say, well, as long as that system's not fully conformed to his intellect and will, he's not going to be determining at least some of the effects. So it could be that any amount that's only partially conformed is going to have some undesired effects. And it's hard to draw the line on how many would manifest, even if it's fully conformed as much as possible, what that's going to look like. But I also suggest that it could be an all or nothing type of thing, like it's just a causal fit. So it's either a full fit or a partial fit, and it really is just one or the other. So a full fit is going to be heaven, a partial fit is going to be the way our universe looks. So that gets into like logical and metaphysical possibilities. So logical possibility is different than metaphysical possibility. So logical possibility would be anything you could think of without contradiction. So you could say, well, God could create a universe that people are just tortured forever. That's logically possible. There's no logical contradiction, but it does seem like there would be a metaphysical problem with that, meaning, or also called like broadly logical impossibility with that, well, an all loving being couldn't create a universe like that, because that's not what a loving being would do. And then when you tease out those tensions, you see, oh, yeah, that would be impossible, even though it didn't initially seem contradictory. So certainly it's logically possible to imagine God creating a different universe, but it may not be broadly possible. And, excuse me, I should say creating a partially conformed universe may not be broadly possible. And when we get into like broad possibility, it's pretty difficult to determine what's broadly possible. So that would be one response. And the other response is, yeah, we just, if the laws are only partially conformed to God's intellect and will, he's not going to determine all the effects. So under both approaches, we just don't know if God broadly could conform it anymore without it being full conformity. So hopefully that made sense.
No, it makes sense. I just think because, all of this relies on intuition anyway. I don't see what's wrong with someone basically their intuition basically like, if I use my imagination, even if you grant that God doesn't control all the effects in the system, you could imagine a system with different laws that's still partially conformed within his intellect and will, and that doesn't lead to like millions of years of animal suffering in evolution. Like you could just use your imagination and intuitively think like, it's probably possible that God could have, even if he doesn't kind of intervene in the system a ton, he could have a different set of laws that would probably prevent some of the massive suffering we see, but also still be partially in accordance with his intellect and will. So again, a lot of this just relies on intuition, so it's hard to make too much progress. But I'm just that's my sort of, I guess, objection to that. But you could just, right. Because like you said, we don't know. I mean, we don't know a lot of this stuff. We don't know what would be. We can say something that's logically possible, but is it really possible? So we're kind of just relying on intuition. But again, I guess what I would say is, what's wrong with that if most of your argument's relying on intuition anyway? So why couldn't the objector rely on counterintuition? Right. So I guess I would just say
can.
Still there?
You can. Yeah, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. You can, but then I would say then, if you want to say you personally think that, but if you were to make the case that suffering is definitely a defeater, or at least is strong probability against theism, I think it would, you would have the burden of proof to argue that. So if you want to say you personally have that intuition I can't talk you out of that. And then it would, if I was to try, then I would probably need to turn to like some theistic arguments and such and try to convince you there. But if you were to say, I should have that intuition, I would say, well, it's your job then to prove that, because I'm just kind of playing defense with, responding to the problem of evil.
Right. No, so I guess the better way of putting it is like my intuition is that God would desire a state of affairs with less extreme suffering. I think that's a plausible intuition. I think that we probably, in a perfect world, would share that intuition. But like the idea is like, if it's true that God would desire a state of affairs with, the least amount of like gratuitous or like really crazy amounts of suffering, then and plus he also needs to create a world that's only partially in accordance with his intellect and will. Then it seems plausible that if there are degrees of partial conformity, he would choose the one that's kind of allows for the least amount of like seemingly gratuitous suffering. So those are the intuitions I'm playing on, not necessarily that. I don't know. That I'm kind of losing my train of thought, but let's move on from that. I mean,
I get what you're saying, and I share that intuition as well. But yeah, so my thought is just that we don't know that that's actually broadly possible. So we can think of that world like, well, why didn't he create a world that there's none of this suffering? But I'm arguing that could be that there just isn't that type of world. You have these laws and they're going to be partially conformed, and this is the results that you get. And maybe they could be varied a little bit, but it's still going to be roughly the type of world we get. Now, I get that somebody's going to say, no, I can imagine some other world, but the argument's going to be, yeah, but that doesn't mean it's broadly possible. I get that somebody may still push back, but I would say, I'm playing defense here, and do we know that that's broadly impossible? I don't think we do.
Mm-hmm. All right, so is libertarian free will even plausible? we can briefly talk about that too.
Sure. I really don't get a lot of the pushback, especially, and I know there are Christian, Calvinists a lot of times share that type of view as well. And I know you have a Calvinist background, but that's not necessarily relevant here. But yeah, I think libertarian free will is just obvious. Like I mean, I can't say like I have Cartesian certainty that we have libertarian free will, but I'm just really inclined to think that we do. Like I feel myself making decisions, and I really don't. I know there are some interesting arguments against it, but I think John Searle makes this point that like any argument against free will is going to be less obvious than the feeling that we have free will. And that's kind of where I come down on it. Like I'm really just not convinced that determinism's more plausible. But then there are people who have the opposite intuition, I guess, and I just don't share that. But
I mean, like, so not from an experiential point necessarily, but like the idea when you start to think about it, like that it kind of leads to like uncaused causes, being the originator of sort of an uncaused cause, and then you have agent causation where it's like people are trying to justify that, and it's like, in all these other areas you can't have uncaused causes, but when it comes to agent causation, you can. And it's like, to me, when I start looking at all into that, it's kind of, I don't want to say silly, but like so like for example, like the kind of logic behind the kalam, it's like whatever begins to exist as a cause, like. My thought began to exist. Therefore, my thought, or like my free decision. Like, I don't know, you can phrase it in a way where it's like my free decision to do X began to exist. Therefore, my free decision to do X has a cause. So, like, you could these kind of like I feel like on the one hand we have well, not everyone actually. Like, there's some people who once they start doing like mindfulness meditation, you start to, and I've done it too, where it's like you start to kind of realize like you kind of experience thoughts coming to you rather than like kind of choosing. I don't want to go into like argue. So I'm saying that. On the one hand, I think it's plausible that it's not obvious to everyone that they have libertarian free will. There's some people, whether it's through meditation or other things, where they start to pay attention. Sorry, my dogs are starting to bark because I think my wife is home. So I'm getting distracted now. There's some people in their experience where they find it not plausible that they have libertarian free will because they'll stop and notice their thoughts and realize that basically their thoughts are almost happening to them rather than them kind of thinking them. So I want to push back a little bit on that. Maybe it seems obvious to you, but I would say not to everyone else, not to everyone. Now I'm getting distracted again. But like the idea that like if you have, so it might conflict with some other like intuitions you have. So say someone thinks very strongly about these causal intuitions that they have about causality, and that might be more basic to them than the seeming that they have libertarian free will. And so under that picture, they think, well, agent cause, this idea of kind of, in a sense, kind of originating from yourself something that's not caused by anything else, like that seems not obvious to them, because once they think about their view of causality, it doesn't really seem to make sense. So I was gently pushing back on those points. I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
Yeah. So yeah, I haven't looked into the arguments on for and against free will as much, so I can't comment on like the literature as much. But so under like agent causation, at least my understanding, or at least the view I would hold, is that our choices are caused; they're caused by us. But you say like, well, what causes you to do that? And I would just say that's just where the buck stops. You just cause it. And honestly, I just don't see anything incoherent about that. So like with the kalam, and of course I'm not a huge defender of the kalam, but
Right.
it's whatever begins to exist. So you say like if the universe didn't exist, it can't bring itself into existence. But to me, that's different than, and I'm not saying that the kalam works or anything. I'm just saying that that's how the argument goes. But with free will, my mind exists, and my mind can originate new choices. And I really don't see anything incoherent about it. I do recognize where somebody has some hangups with it. And again, I find some of the arguments against free will to be interesting. But yeah, I don't share the feeling that they really work. But yeah, that's just where I'll come down on that.
Yeah, I haven't read it. I haven't read everything. I just, so I can't really comment too much on the literature. That's another area that I'd like to go read into more as I kind of, read more into philosophy of religion. Those are my kind of prima facie like worries with it when it seems to be that it's like trying to have your cake and eat it too. It's almost like you have my impression is that people want to have certain causal intuitions when it comes to defending certain arguments for God, and they don't want to take the logic of those causal intuitions and apply it to their their treasured possession of libertarian free will. That's just my, on the surface view. Again, I have to read more too, so I won't come down hard on that. But it also seems too that if someone finds some version of compatibilism plausible, that you froze. Can you hear me? No. Do. Oh, he's coming back. Now there's two of them. I can't hear you. There you are. Let me remove the other one. Okay. Yeah, I don't know what happened. I don't know what you've heard.
Yeah, it cut out a little. Well, you were wrapping up on like there are different views on causality and arguments for God, and somebody may not, apply the same criteria they do about like their causal arguments for God that they would free will. So there could be an inconsistency there. That was the last thing I heard.
Okay. All right. So my other point was, it seems like, yeah. The other thing I was about to say was, it seems like if you accept the perfect, I mean, you commented on it briefly, but I'm not sure we're going to agree on this, because it seemed like what you were saying, there's the determinism objection, as you call it. I don't know if you said determinism versus compatibilism for a reason, but the idea to me is like, it seems that if, in order to accept the perfect will theodicy, you basically would have to dismiss all versions of compatibilism as like not either incoherent or like immoral in some way. And I just don't find, like, I understand, like, I definitely find certain versions of compatibilism immoral. But I think that you can distinguish between certain kinds of it. So for example, suppose compatibilism is true. And again, we suppose we don't have libertarian free will and everyone's created in heaven and with compatibilist freedom to basically do what they want in accordance with their nature. And they love God and basically forever enter into God's goodness and joy and experience that, new adventures every day, blah, blah, blah. It's like, it seems to me that there's nothing, and again, I guess this just goes back to like intuitions, but like, I don't find compatibilism simplicator. I don't know how you say that. Simpliciter. I don't find compatibilism simpliciter to be problematic. So my intuition, one of my intuitions that would conflict with the perfect will theodicy is that I don't find compatibilism implausible on its own. I find certain versions of it implausible, but not simpliciter, simplicator, whatever. So I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, I don't find compatibilism in itself logically incoherent. I mean, as a causal theory, or however you want to put it, like, yeah, it makes sense. Like, I don't think there's a logical incoherence in it. But I would argue then that it would still, coercion, at least at an extreme level, would still be immoral under, at least I'm arguing, under compatibilism. So even if we lack libertarian free will and have compatibilist freedom, I would argue it's still wrong for God to force somebody into a relation with him. And somebody could argue, well, no, it wouldn't be if we have compatibilist freedom. And I guess then that's just where there would be an intuitional disagreement. So actually, I mean, I think personally, I think the theodicy is compatible with compatibilism, or any type of determinism, because I would still argue that it's the forced relation aspect that's immoral. I think that
But I
that
mean, like,
does make it.
just say we're not. You're not, like you just said. I mean, on compatibilist versions of freedom, a forced relation would be a different definition. You're using a different definition than they would use. For a compatibilist, a forced relation wouldn't be someone doing what they want in accordance with their nature. That's not a force. I mean, even if God is orchestrating it at the upper level, they would just say, which is why Calvinists are able to say, like, it's not a. I don't know. I mean, I don't want to get into all that, but like, you could have a compatibilist, someone. So say that you're like a Calvinist universalist, which is a thing. Someone could argue, like, ultimately, like, there's nothing incoherent or like immoral about it, because everyone's doing what they want in accordance with their nature, and that will ultimately be to love God, in the end. So I guess they would just reject your definition of a forced relation, depending on, however you define things.
Yeah, they would have to share this intuition that whether or not we have libertarian free will or not, that God cannot, that there still has to be so like my understanding of like compatibilism and would be that people still make what seem to be, free choices, but it's still determined. But, you still experience yourself making day-to-day decisions. So like the example I use is, imagine we found out it was definitively proven that, we have compatibilist freedom. I still think it would be wrong for me to go and say, okay, well, say we also have the love machine. Well, I'm going to place you in the love machine then, because we don't have libertarian free will after all. Like, that still seems wrong, even if we have compatibilist freedom. So I'm saying, well, if God's in that situation, he's in that situation too then. Now, again, I recognize that makes the argument a little trickier. So that's why I'm willing to defend that it needs libertarian free will, but I'm not convinced that it does. But hopefully that made sense.
Well, I mean, I guess every single choice. I mean, if compatibilism is true, every choice you make, whether good or bad, would be a love machine choice. So you'd have to deny that compatibilism works. Period. I think that you'd have to, because you can't just. I think you drawing a distinction between like coming into a relation with God versus everything else. I mean, literally, I think if you're going to be consistent with the love machine analogy, you'd have to apply that to every choice you make on compatibilist freedom, regardless, because everything, in a sense, would be coerced, and not just in relation to God. I mean, under your view. So I think, and that's my pushback. I think the disagreement we would have, I mean, we'd have to explore this more. I don't want to get caught up in it because there's other things I want to talk about. But I think my understanding of your theodicy is that it's incompatible with compatibilism, because you would have to. I think the love machine. I think it just doesn't. I think any choice you make would be coerced on the way you describe what it means to be coerced in a choice.
Yeah, I'm willing to concede that for now, because that'll get us into a different view, which I'm willing to grant that the theodicy needs libertarian free will, but I'm still not convinced that it does. But yeah, let's keep going, because that's kind of a different point. But yeah, I see what you're saying though.
So what was your definition of evil? How do you define evil? It's just kind of a little bit off topic, but.
So I do like the privation view that evil is the lacking of what's good, but I know there are some critiques of that. I'm not convinced that they work, but so yeah, I would say anything disordered is evil, or anything that lacks something it's supposed to have is evil. I more like framing the problem of evil in terms of problem of suffering, though, because I think that makes it a little more acute for the theist, because they could say, like, they could take a privation view and say, well, evil is just a lacking, and then it's like, yeah, but even if that's the case, why does God allow extreme suffering? That's really what we want to know. So I really like framing it more in the problem of suffering, and I also think that there are some reasonable objections against like good and evil having like real ontology, that I feel like it can get into kind of the weeds of like semantics and debates about that. But that's how I would define it, though, that evil is like a disorder that shouldn't be there.
So I guess my follow-up question is, so if evil is like a lack of good or disorder, then isn't anything that's not in accordance with God's will evil?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that's probably the case.
But isn't the creation that's not in accordance with God's intellect and will evil?
Yeah, I mean, it would be a necessary evil, but it wouldn't be something that God's willing for its own sake. So you can, I think it's justified to allow a lesser evil in order to bring about a greater good. So if you want to call it, yeah, I would look at it like that. But again, it's like I look at evil more as a moral category. So when you say it's not in accordance with God's will, I'm thinking more in moral terms. So like if I go and do something that's not in accordance with God's will, that would be an evil of me. But like say that there's a deformity in nature, we could call that a natural, and we could even say like God brings that about, but that wouldn't be the same thing as willing a moral evil. So if you say like, well, God's created a universe with evil, I would say if by that you mean disorder, yeah, I agree. But a lot of times it's like it wouldn't entail like God has created an evil substance in like a Maniacan sense. So I wouldn't look at that as a problem, but yeah, so that's how I would respond there.
Yeah, I guess I just what I was trying to push on is like it seems like if God creates something against God's will, like under a lot of conceptions of what evil means, then you're basically just saying God creates evil. Like it's just semantically the same. You're basically just saying God creates like. I think that that's prima facie problematic. At least for me, it would be.
It depends
How,
upon what.
how does it make sense
Yeah.
for a perfect being to create evil? If we're defining, I mean, if we're being careful to define terms like that, that seems to me because normally what you'll try to say is like God created the world good and like we ruined it or some fallen event. I mean, it depends. I mean, because obviously the Christians accept evolution and death, you know, before the fall and stuff like that. But like, I just think depending on how you define evil, it can get tricky to say things like God created a world that went against God's will in any way. Like, I don't know. I'd have to again explore this more before I.
Yeah.
It just seems at least.
That would be one. I agree. We need to parse terms. I think that can get gotten around. I mean, first of all, I mean, an easy out, I guess, would be like, what is it, Isaiah 45:7? It says God does create evil, and of course that's a problematic verse. But a lot of times that gets interpreted as like, well, this is natural evils, and of course God creates those. So,
Right.
but also even in Genesis, it says God made all things and said
Trying to
they were
push
good.
specific views. Not
Right.
yeah.
Right, but in Genesis it says God made all things good, but humans were very good. And you could say, well, if the world is just good, but it's not God, you could say, well, it has a degree of evil then, even if evil's lacking. And it's like, oh, well, then God created evil. And it's like, yeah, but like, to me, the worry about saying God creates evil is if there is some kind of ontology that God himself doesn't possess, that he then brings about. That would be, at least doesn't possess in a higher degree. So like God either lacks a perfection or he brings about something that is wholly imperfect. That's where it would get into, that to me, that's where it would get problematic. And that's not what I'm arguing. I'm just saying things could be better. And if you want to call that evil or has a degree of evil, I would agree. But to me, it's not evil in the problematic sense. It's just evil in the sense that it's diminished. And saying that God created something and he has good reasons for why it's diminished, I don't see a problem with that. So, but I agree. I mean, it's important to parse terms. And if you really were to press me, then I would just say evil is a moral perversion. And if that's the case, and if we have free will, then God's not the author of any evil because we're the author of it. And other things I would just call natural disorders. And yeah, God's the causal source of them, but I just won't call them evil. And I'll just change the definition then of evil. So it really gets into, I mean, I'm not huge on like defining evil because I mean, I like the privation view, but and I would just call it the privation of good. But if you want to call it a disorder, but if you really were to press me, I would just say, well, it's not a disorder. Then I'll just define it differently. I don't really see that as like, to me, that's just, I don't really care that much about how I define evil.
Okay.
So I don't know, but
Yeah, I guess I was getting at. It seems like there's a difference between like say an imperfection, some kind of like imperfection resulting because of something like a perfect being did, versus an imperfection coming directly from the perfect being. And so like I guess depending on how you define evil, like just if you're just creating by fiat or whatever, just creating this thing that's imperfect, you know, has tons of imperfections with it, versus like creating something and then it, you know, certain things that result from that creation cause it to go, you know, further into imperfection. I don't know. I'd have to explore a little more before I keep talking about this. But I
yeah.
know there's feel like there's something there, but I have to.
Yeah, there's
Deeper
a fair objection there. I feel like it's that one. I feel like it's more semantics because it comes down to like what's morally justified. So if it's morally justified, then God is good in doing it. Yeah, but yeah, well, that's another one we could set aside for a second because it gets into some tricky semantics. But yeah.
Okay. All right. So I made a couple slides. If we want to get into that, and maybe I can ask because I read in an hour. I don't want to go too long, but So I haven't shared my screen before. I tested this before, so let's see what happens. Share screen. All right, Chrome tab. This one, share.
All right.
All right. So let me go down and present. There we go. Okay. So argument one. So I want to see what your thoughts are on this. I didn't develop these like in any kind of like extensive way. A couple hours before this, I just sat down, read your paper again, and just thought like, let me put some of this stuff into arguments so that way it's a little more clear, like where our disagreement lies. So this is kind of this argument and a couple others kind of summarize the premature death objection, which is to me, honestly, my bigger objections. So argument one, a forced relation is wrong because it violates a person's autonomy, which is something you basically hinted at or said explicitly in the first paragraph of the paper. Two, coming into conscious awareness for the first time in a heavenly state and choosing God does not violate a person's autonomy. Find that plausible because I think if I was a Christian, I would think babies could go to heaven. Three, therefore, coming to conscious awareness for the first time in a heavenly state and choosing God is not a forced relation. So, And again, I think if you grant this argument, then I think certain portions of your theodicy are in trouble because then why isn't everyone created in heaven? I think that you could plausibly, if this argument works, you could say, well, then why, if all of this is sound, I don't see why we weren't created in heaven. And I think that the way that you try to defend your theodicy doesn't work. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on these premises.
Right. So I would want to rephrase premise one to say an intentionally forced relation is morally wrong. So, and as I point out in the video and the paper, that it's based on God's intention. So if there's an unintended side effect, then that's not what God's intending. So he does intend for everyone to go to heaven, hopefully, but because this system of laws isn't working the way that he's intending, at least fully intending, then there are premature deaths. But if you want to then call that a forced, and I agree that children who die go to heaven, you could say they are forced there, but that wasn't God's intention for them to be forced. And you could say, well, what's the difference? But then that's going to get into a moral intuition. So, and then I'm referring to a moral principle called double effect, where if something's an unintended side effect, then it is the agent is not culpable for it if they did not intend that side effect.
But you have to. So this is where I would disagree. God could plausibly have another world, and again, you have another world that the baby's dying infancy go to choose God. You can't. It's not forcing God's hand to take children to heaven when they die. So basically, what I'm saying is, if you find it plausible that a baby could go to heaven, I think that intuition, if you cash it out, still, I know I've said this before, I still think it has problems for your theodicy because I think it's plausible that what makes a force. So when you add in an intentionally forced relation, I just think, again, this is just a battle of intuitions. I think if libertarian free will is a real thing, what's wrong with the forced relation is that it violates a person's autonomy, period. And so I think so are you saying that premise two, coming to conscious awareness for the first time in heavenly state and choosing God does not violate a person's autonomy? Are you saying that it would violate are you saying a baby's autonomy would be violated on your view?
I'm saying I'm willing to grant that would be the case. I'm not sure, but I'm willing to grant the premise two. So then it would come down to rephrasing premise one. Now, if you want to say, well, God would take them to a different universe, okay. I mean, you can have that. I mean, there are some people who have that theology, and maybe that they could accept the theodicy, but then they would need to make room for that. That's not my view, but it wouldn't. Yeah, go ahead.
So
I want to. Yeah, go ahead.
So when you say an intentionally forced, I guess my hang up here is like when you say an intentionally forced relationship, he's still like if a baby dies and God takes them to heaven, he's intentionally taking them to heaven. Like that's intentional. It's still, I mean, yeah, in the wider scheme of things, like he'd rather not be that way. But like, even if you rephrase it, an intentionally forced relation is wrong, I would still say that still counts. If a baby dies and God intentionally takes them to heaven and they wake up for the first time consciously and they choose God, like I don't know if adding intentionally would actually get you out of that. On my view, I guess what I would say is, if it's the case that the violation of autonomy is doing the work here as something that's immoral, because the whole point of your theodicy is that God can't do things that are wrong, and so there's some deontic thing about God's nature that wouldn't allow him to do certain things. And I think if we place a high value on violating personal autonomy, then taking a baby directly to heaven and they wake up and they choose God, I feel like that would be, you could argue, someone with similar moral intuitions could argue that that's deontically God could not do that because it's violating someone's autonomy. And I think that's totally plausible to me if I accept some of the moral intuitions of your system, I would say. And so it's kind of, I'm not saying that I share all these intuitions. I'm just kind of like an internal kind of poking to see how, I don't know. I could probably word this differently, but it just seems to me that, and so basically what I'm trying to say is too, I think it's plausible. I'm trying to use the intuition that babies go to heaven as a way, because I think that most Christians, whether they're Calvinists or any, would find it plausible that a baby would go to heaven. Right. And so I'm trying to use that intuition and try to say, like, well, if that's true, then some of these intuitions about that undergird some of your other parts of your argument might not be sound. If you hold to this idea that babies go to heaven, that's really what I'm trying to do.
No, I get it. And in fairness, I think this is the strongest objection to the theodicy as I've talked about in the past. But I would say, though, that there's a couple of things. And again, I wouldn't personally take this out with my theology. I do agree that babies and children go to heaven if they die. But somebody could speculate that God has another limbo type place where they then go, and they could still reconcile that with the theodicy. But again, that's not my view, but it is an out somebody could explore. Okay. But I would say, though, so it comes down to what's God's intention. So what's wrong with force in a relation is the intentional aspect of it. So
it's not. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to interrupt you. Go ahead.
Oh, it's okay. So going back to like the love machine analogy, since that's the analogy I start with, imagine somebody like falls into the love machine accidentally. They trip and fall into it, and there's no way to reverse the damage or whatever, the consequences of that. I mean, it wasn't anybody's intention for that to happen. It's not a bad thing that it did happen, but that is what happened, and that's more what I'm looking at. And I get that you're saying, yeah, but God takes them to heaven, isn't that? And what I'm saying is
heaven. They're
right, but no. Here's the thing, though. Here's the thing, though. That, and I'm not saying you agree with me here, but the way the causal interaction is working within the theodicy is that God has these ideal intentions, and then there are these partial intentions. He doesn't change what the ideal intentions are. So if he has this ideal intention that if somebody was to die, they then go to heaven if they're in a justified state, then that's just going to apply to somebody. He's not factoring into that causal intention, well, what if they're this and that? So I'm saying that there's this unintended side effect that you now have young people dying, which wasn't never a part of God's intention. Now I get that that's metaphysically maybe kind of strange, but that's kind of how I'm conceiving of it, that he has these ideal intentions and it's kind of meeting the rubber with these unintended side effects, and this is an unintended side effect. So honestly, like I still do find it that a plausible response, but I get if you don't agree with me on that. I think this is the most challenging objection, but that's just kind of where my intuition comes down on. But it's certainly something as well that we keep exploring. So
yeah. So one last thought on this. There's another argument that's kind of related to this, but so it seems to me that so basically it just comes down to, on your view, a force relation isn't intrinsically wrong then. So it's so I guess what
intentionally.
But well, at all, I'm saying just a force relation period. There's nothing intrinsically or inherently wrong with it, because God can't do anything that's inherently wrong. But on your view, sometimes God does force a relation. I'm talking in general categories here. Not, I know you're adding the intentionally, but I'm saying, like, let's take the category force relations. Is there anything intrinsically wrong with that? There can't be, because God does it sometimes. So it seems like the entailment of what you're saying is that there's nothing intrinsically wrong with force relations, because if God does any force relations under any circumstances, it couldn't be intrinsically wrong because God does it and God can't sin.
Yeah. Well, taking away the word intentional, though, really changes the morality of it. So something can have good consequences, and if you're a consequentialist, that's all that matters. But if you're a deontologist, the intention is really key. And sometimes it's both. Sometimes something can have a bad intention and bad consequences. But in this case, it would be a good. If it was intended, that would be bad, even if it has good consequences. But what I'm saying is, it's an unintended event that has a good consequence. So the intention makes all the difference here. So,
right, but you're still saying it's not always wrong to force a relation under any circumstance. There's some circumstance.
Well, what I'm saying is that God doesn't do the forcing. I'm saying that the causal factors do. So that's where the word intention is really key, whether or not God would be blameworthy or not. So when you say, is it always wrong? Well, it's not wrong for the laws of physics to do anything, because the laws of physics are not personal beings. So that's why I think the word intentional is key.
I know, but do the laws of physics take baby souls to heaven?
Yeah.
The laws of physics?
Yes, because that's where I'm saying that and not laws of physics like in the sense of like gravity and such, but I'm saying these deeper, when I'm using the word laws of physics, I'm meaning causal laws that undergird everything that's not God. So if they're angels, they're in accordance with some kind of physical laws too, is what I'd be suggesting. So, but yeah, so God has these ideal intentions that if anybody was to die, then they would go to, and they're in a justified, sanctified state, however you want to put it, they would go to live with God. That's God's ideal intention. Well, young people die. It's not God's intention for them to die, but they go to live in a sanctified state with Him.
Okay, I think this will be good, because moving on to another one that kind of, okay. So this is, I think, is another plausible intuition. So if we have libertarian free will, then a forced relation can plausibly be defined as a violation of libertarian free will. This is where we're going to disagree. Coming to conscious awareness for the first time in a heavenly state and choosing God is not a violation of libertarian free will. Therefore, if we have libertarian free will, then coming to conscious awareness for the first time in a heavenly state and choosing God is not a forced relation. So I think, and this is, again, the problem with this is, it's not a problem, but like, again, all this kind of relies on our intuitions about what it means. So we're talking about forced relation and you're saying, intentionally forced relation, blah, blah. I think, if it were me, if I were like a libertarian free will person, I would not understand a forced relation in the same way you do. I would understand it as forced relation is something that violates someone's libertarian free will. And I think that you could have someone coming to conscious awareness for the first time and exercise their libertarian free will to choose God, and therefore not have a forced relation under that kind of system. So again, this is just another, I know this is just, I'm putting in an argument, but really the argument is just highlighting how someone could have totally different intuitions about what it means to force a relation. So I'd go ahead and give you a chance to comment on that.
Okay, so premise one, if we have libertarian free will, then a forced relation can be plausibly defined as a violation. Okay, yeah, I think I agree with that. Then premise two, coming to conscious awareness for the first time in a heavenly state and choosing God is not a violation of libertarian free will. So I'd want to add in the caveat that choosing God without any possibility of not choosing God. So I agree, like, choosing God is not a violation of free will. And being in heaven, choosing God, that's not a violation of free will. But if you had no possibility of not choosing God, that's what would be the violation. And it's not that it takes away free will, it takes away the morally significant component that I would say that would be essential to the situation.
A baby that dies and goes to heaven has, I know in a sense they have an opportunity, because like God's like, well, I had a system of laws that gave them a quote unquote opportunity, but they didn't have a personal opportunity to not choose God. So again, if I were in your shoes and had similar intuitions, and I still don't know if I would agree with you here, I would just say that violation of libertarian free will is more like, so I would say that a baby does not have a real opportunity to not choose God in a state where they could really, like in this kind of world where the laws are not perfectly in accordance with God's intellect and will. So it seems to me that if babies go to heaven and their libertarian free will is not violated and they can choose God, and even though they never had a real opportunity, on my understanding of what a real opportunity would be to not choose God, then it doesn't seem to me why, again, the creating people in a heavenly bliss and having an analogous situation. I understand, I guess I think this just highlights, like, I feel like your theodicy, you have to have a lot of very specific intuitions that I'm not really sure a lot of people share. I guess that's my biggest, because it's based on intuitions about what God's obligations are. I think one of the weaknesses of it is, it seems to me that like, I just don't know how many people even that would have conceptions of libertarian free will would necessarily share all these intuitions about. So your whole point is that it's plausible, and I just don't know. I think some of these arguments, some of the things I've said, there's a lot of other plausible intuitions that one could have, even if they were a libertarian free will person and had similar intuitions that would just go against the plausibility of what you're claiming. So that's, I said that at the beginning, but I'm just trying to cash it out now as we're going through this. But go ahead and keep,
Yeah. Well, I just want to clarify that it's not that it's a taking away of libertarian free will in the sense that somebody loses their libertarian free will, but it's that in order to make a morally significant choice with one's libertarian free will, you need the opportunity to have made that, exercise that choice. Now, I agree that, a child dies, a baby dies, goes to heaven. They didn't really get that opportunity per se, but it all goes back to what was God's intention. Now, I agree that one could push back, as you're doing, and say, like, yeah, but come on, like, I really think it comes down to what's God's intention and how does that causal interaction work. And you could say, well, somebody else doesn't hold that intuition. Sure, but given the totality of, say, somebody finds theism plausible and so on, I don't like. To me, it kind of comes down to a draw in my mind. Now, you can totally disagree, but I don't know that I need to demonstrate it definitely is the case. I think it just has to be plausible, and I think it is plausible, but I understand that you may not share that intuition. But to say, though, well, it comes down to intuitions, I mean, yeah, but I would argue all arguments come down to intuition, once you follow the rabbit hole far enough.
No, I agree, but what I'm saying is that you have one, you're saying X is plausible, and I'm saying X, Y, Z, other letters are plausible, and all these plausible things go against the plausible thing that you're saying. That's really what I'm saying. That's really ultimately what I'm saying. I'm trying to make a case that there are lots of intuitions that are plausible that conflict with your, because your point is here's this theodicy that's plausible, and all I'm saying is here are these other ways you could look at it that are, on my view, equally plausible or more plausible. And if you add them up, or at least choose one of any of the things that I'm bringing up, then it seems like it doesn't work. Your theodicy doesn't work. But I'll have one more. I don't want to go too long because we're already almost an hour and 20. Okay, so again, another plausible intuition here. Plausibly, God has a moral obligation not to actualize worlds that will contain gratuitous suffering. Perfect will theodicy world contains gratuitous suffering. God has a moral obligation not to actualize perfect will theodicy world. I think this is a little bit different than what I said before, but I think, if it's plausible to say that God can't force relations because it's immoral, I think that you could easily make a case that it's immoral for God to actualize a world with gratuitous suffering, not just suffering, but suffering that's like gratuitous in a sense where it's like you said, God, like there's not necessarily an ultimate purpose for instances of suffering. So I think your theodicy entails that there is gratuitous suffering. I think you even say that in the paper somewhere, at least kind of hint at it. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it would be compatible with there being gratuitous suffering in the particular sense. So it's not gratuitous in the end because, but we talked about that at the beginning. But yeah, so again, I would want to rephrase premise one to say, plausibly, God has a moral obligation not to intentionally actualize a world that contains gratuitous suffering. So yeah, I think with all these objections, it's going to get down to, maybe our disagreement is, it's going to get down to what God's intention is and what's the result. Because I would say, so just to kind of summarize where I think we're disagreeing is, I'm going to say that God is justified in creating. He is, because his intention is to bring about eternal happiness, but he also has this moral obligation that he cannot force humans into this. And also I want to clarify the theodicy does apply to angels as well, because sometimes people bring that point up. But any creature that's not God, he has this obligation not to intentionally force beings into a relation with him. So if he wants to create a world that it's going to have creatures, it's going to have to be a world that is only partially conformed to God's intellect and will. And then from there, I would just say that the chips fall as they lie. There's going to then be unintended side effects, and people are going to die before they're able to make free choices. There's going to be these gratuitous sufferings, and then you say, yeah, but God didn't, I thought God wasn't supposed to do those things. And it's like, right, that wasn't his plan. So these unintended side effects, children dying young, gratuitous suffering occurring, the whole point was that these were all unintended side effects, but this was the only way causally, I mean, this was inevitable if God wants to create the universe. Now, again, I'm not saying your objections are illegitimate, but that's just how I'd respond to them all as a whole.
Right, but I'm so the intentional part, like I'm saying, if God has foreknowledge, like if I create this world partially conforming to God to my intellect and will, there will be, and knowing that there will be gratuitous suffering, I'm saying it's plausible that he would have a moral obligation not to create anything. I'm saying that I don't see that intuition as any less plausible than the intuition of your whole theodicy is founded on, which is not to force. So I get there's some prima facie, you want to appeal to like intuitions about forcing relations, but I think that there's just as plausible to say, well, okay, if God has foreknowledge and he looks and says, well, if I create, I have to create a world partially in accordance with my intellect and will, and if I do that, then there's going to be gratuitous suffering. I think that it's plausible to say, well, then God would have a moral obligation just not to create anything. Yeah. I don't see anything plausible about that intuition at all.
Yeah. Well, I do want to point out, you said if God has foreknowledge of it. Now, I'm not an open theist, but I'm very skeptical of that Molinism would be true. I do think your objection seems like it rests on Molinism being true, and I'm personally am really skeptical of Molinism from honestly, I kind of want to vie for Molinism, but I honestly think that the grounding problem is a serious problem, but I'll let you respond there.
So, I mean, so on your view, it could be possible for God to create. So I guess my understanding of traditional theism is that when you say God is all-knowing, I mean, he would know that if I create world with state of affairs X, that there would be, you're saying that's possible that he created, on your view, he could have created a world partially in accordance with his intellect and will and not known that there would be gratuitous suffering that would happen as a result of that.
Right, and he would know that would be a real possibility, but he wouldn't know precisely how things would manifest. And it's not because I'm an open theist per se, but if somebody wants to call that open theism, that they can, but it's just not a pre-creational foreknowledge.
I would say too, I don't know if you've watched this, but there's a David Bentley Hart, I don't know if it's a lecture about creation ex nihilo, where he kind of gives worries about what you just said, where it's like, when you create, God's kind of like, it's almost like God's rolling the dice. So there's another objection nearby that even if you say, okay, God didn't know there'd be gratuitous suffering, well, I mean, if you're kind of rolling the dice there about what he would at least know that it's possible for gratuitous suffering to exist, then you could just push the problem back a step and say, well, if you know it's possible that gratuitous suffering is going to exist, in the state of affairs you create, is that, does God have a moral obligation not to do that then and sort of roll the dice, as it were? I think you could just push it back and then have those concerns. But again, I really want to keep this short. I don't want to keep going too long. But
let me respond to those real quick, though. So
I'll let you. Let me get
go ahead.
Screen off first.
Oh, okay.
Let's let you say whatever you want to say about anything. Closing comment.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you having me on. I've enjoyed the discussion, and a lot of other channels aren't interested in having me come on. But so I'm not. What was that?
It's because you're so obnoxious. I'm just kidding. Joke.
Yeah, I'm not really that. I've heard that objection. I guess Sobel makes that type of objection. I'm not really moved by the idea of like, well, God's reckless then for creating. It's like, well, but if that's the only way that he can bring it about, that there's going to be, I mean, that to me, that's just kind of a logically necessitated situation. If it's logically impossible to have mental knowledge, but God wants to create beings with free will, and all these things are required. I mean, you could say like, well, that's risky, and it's like, okay, well then God took a risk. Like I personally don't have a problem with that if that's really the best option, but I that's a fair worry. But in regards to but let's just say Molinism is correct, and God does have this pre-creational foreknowledge. It's still, I think if this really is the hand that God is metaphysically dealt, so to speak, like these are the logical limitations, I still think God is justified in creating. He's going to know that there's going to be gratuitous suffering. He's going to know children are going to die young, and unfortunately won't be able to make a free choice about their relation with God. These aren't things God wants to be the case, but I don't know. I think God's desire to create is a greater desire. I think it is more like, again, if it's sometimes somebody can be in a situation where you do have a morally difficult choice and you go with the lesser of two evils, and I think that God would still be justified. So the more I think about it, I'm not sure that Molinism would cause any harm to the theodicy, but it is worth exploring because I mean you do raise fair points. And personally, I'm very skeptical of Molinism. So if somebody raises a point that seems like it requires Molinism, my inclination is to say, well, I'm not a Molinist, but I don't want to jettison Molinism either because it's like I don't know that it's not true, and there are people who do like it. But yeah, so that's my thoughts there, and you can respond back to that if you want or close it out. It's up to you, but I'm done for now.
William Lane Craig is disappointed in you for rejecting Molinism.
Yeah.
I think we can. I'll let you have the last word here. I think this was a good discussion. I think it was good. I mean, like I said, we talked about it a little bit, but it was more of a broad interview before. This was kind of getting more into it. Maybe in the future. And again, I was just more kind of tossing things back and forth here, but I may, write more extensively and try to hone my objections in the future just to see.
Yeah.
But I've enjoyed having you on. Thanks for coming on. I appreciate it. It's good.
Yeah. Thanks.